The wind came first before the snow, sliding down from the ridge like something that had been waiting all season for permission, and Willa Prescott stood in the doorway of the general store in the town of Miller's Bend with her hands raw from the cold and her voice raw from asking, and the man behind the counter would not look at her twice. She had asked for 3 sacks of grain and a length of rope and a tin of matches on credit, promising to pay when the thaw came, and the storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Otto Bergman, who had known her husband for 6 years, shook his head slowly and said the words that would follow her the rest of that winter. "I can't be extending credit to a widow with no land in her name, Mrs. Prescott. It isn't personal, it's business." The room had gone quiet around her, the way rooms did when they wanted to watch something without seeming to watch it, and Willa had felt the heat rise in her face before the cold outside could remind her what shame was worth against frostbite. She left without another word, her dog, Copper, padding at her heel, his golden coat catching the gray light through the window glass, and outside the wind hit her like a verdict. That had been the moment, though she would not understand it until later, when the whole shape of what was coming pressed itself against the town and found every door locked against it. She walked home along the frozen creek bed with Copper beside her, his nose low, catching some scent she could not name, and she did not yet know that 16 days earlier, in a bed in the back room of that same small house, her husband, Robert Prescott, had pressed a folded piece of oilcloth into her hand and whispered 5 words that she had not understood at the time. "The mountain remembers what we forget." He had died before dawn, and she had buried him under frozen ground with the help of 2 neighbors who left as soon as the dirt was packed, and she had put the oilcloth map into a drawer without looking at it properly, because grief does not leave room for cartography. Robert had been sick through the autumn, a wasting cough that the doctor in the next county called consumption, though he admitted he could not be certain. And in the last weeks he had grown strange and urgent, spending hours out in the barn when he could barely stand, coming back in with dirt under his nails and a look on his face like a man settling a debt. Willa had thought it was delirium. She had held his hand through the nights and told him to rest, and he had gripped her fingers with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his failing body, and said, "When it comes, you go to the map. Don't wait for anyone to believe you. Just go." She had promised, the way you promise a dying man anything, meaning it and not meaning it in equal measure, because promises made at a bedside are a different currency than promises kept in daylight. After the funeral, she had gone through his things in pieces, unable to do it all at once, and she had found notes tucked into the seams of his coat, folded twice and creased soft from handling, notes that read like a man talking to himself in the dark. One said, 12 paces from the split pine, count them true. Another said, the door only opens from the low side. Remember the low side. She had not understood them then. She understood the oilcloth even less, a hand-drawn map showing the ridge above the valley, a series of switchbacks, a stand of trees marked with a small cross, and beyond it a shape that looked, if she squinted, like a mouth in the rock. She had folded it back into the drawer and gone on with the business of surviving a Wyoming winter alone, chopping her own wood, drawing her own water before the well froze solid, feeding the chickens that remained after the fox got the rest, and leaning more each week on Copper, the golden retriever Robert had brought home as a pup 3 years before. who now slept across the foot of her bed and would not leave her side even to chase rabbits, as though he understood something about the shape of the year that she had not yet let herself see. It was 2 weeks after the refusal at Bergman's store that the sky changed color in a way Willa had never seen. A yellow-green bruise low on the horizon that the old-timers called the color before the big snow. And that was when she understood that the 5 words her husband had given her were not the ramblings of a fever. She went first to Otto Bergman again, not for credit this time, but for information, asking if he had heard the old stories about caves in the ridge above the valley, and he had waved her off with the same flat refusal, saying he had grain to weigh and no time for widows' tales, though she noticed his hands were shaking as he said it, and she understood later that his own cellar was shallow and his own stores were thin, and that his refusal was not cruelty, but a man refusing to look at his own danger reflected in someone else's face. She went to the Hollis family next, decent people who had loaned her a plow horse in the spring, and Mrs. Hollis had met her at the door with an apology already forming, explaining that with 6 mouths to feed and a roof that already leaked, they could not spare a single sack of anything. But she pressed a small tin of tallow candles into Willa's hands before she left, murmuring that it was not much, but it was what she had. Willa took it and did not argue, because she had learned that people give what they can give and refuse what they must refuse, and the 2 things are not always about kindness or its absence. The last person she went to was a strange, weathered woman named Odessa Vance, who lived at the edge of town in a cabin surrounded by traps and dried herbs, a woman the children were warned away from, and the adults spoke of only in lowered voices, though everyone agreed she knew the mountain better than any surveyor who had ever come through with his instruments and his confidence. Odessa did not invite her in. She stood in the doorway with a shawl pulled tight and listened to Willa describe the map, the split pine, the low door, and when Willa finished, Odessa was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Your husband found the old Delacroix shelter. Trappers built it 2 generations back, deep enough in the rock that no storm has ever touched what's inside it. I helped a man draw a map to it once, years ago, and I never thought I'd hear of it again." Willa asked her to come along, to guide them, and Odessa shook her head with something like regret crossing her weathered face. "My knees won't take that climb any more, and my time is better spent seeing to my own preparations. But I'll tell you what I remember, and you'd best listen close, because I'll only say it once." She spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, describing landmarks and warnings in a voice that gave nothing away twice, telling Willa to trust the dog's nose over her own eyes when the snow began to fall thick enough to erase the trail, telling her the door of the shelter opened only if you pushed low and to the left, never straight on, telling her that the mechanism inside required patience and not force, that a thing built to survive did not surrender to a person in a hurry. Then she stepped back inside and closed her door, and Willa stood alone in the cold with the strange comfort of having been told the truth by someone who owed her nothing. She went home and began to pack with the meticulous care of a woman who understood that every mistake in preparation became a debt paid in the mountains. She counted her matches and split them into 2 tins in case one was lost. She rolled dried meat and hardtack into oilcloth bundles and tied them with cord. She packed a small hatchet, a coil of rope, a single blanket doubled over for warmth, a tin cup, a flint striker as backup to the matches, a few candles from Mrs. Hollis's tin, and the folded map itself, which she now carried against her chest inside her coat, as though it were a second heart. She saddled the mule, an aging but steady animal named Pepper, and loaded what supplies she could onto its back, knowing that speed mattered less than certainty on a mountain that did not forgive haste. Copper watched all of this with an alertness that had been building for days, pacing near the door, refusing his food, and when she finally stepped outside into the gray hush of a morning that smelled like snow not yet fallen, he was already at the gate, waiting, as though he had known the hour before she announced it to herself. They left Miller's Bend behind them at first light, the town small and gray against the white hills, smoke rising thin from a dozen chimneys that had refused her one thing or another over the past weeks. And she did not look back with anger, only with the strange, hollow feeling of a woman leaving behind everyone who would later wish they had listened. The trail climbed steadily for the first 2 hours, the mule's breath coming in visible clouds, Copper ranging ahead and returning, his golden coat stark against the increasingly white ground. By midday, the sky had thickened into the color Odessa had warned her about, a flat pewter ceiling pressing low over the ridgeline, and the wind had begun its low complaint through the pines. She stopped to check the map against the landscape, matching the switchbacks drawn in her husband's careful hand to the actual folds of the land, and found with a small tightening in her chest that they matched exactly. That he had walked this route himself at some point in his failing months, weak as he was, gathering the knowledge he would leave behind for her, like a man packing a lunch for a child's first day at a new school. Not knowing exactly what she would need, but determined to leave nothing out that he could think of. The first obstacle came at a creek crossing, where the ice had gone thin and gray in the middle, the kind of ice that looked solid and was not, and Copper stopped dead at the bank and would not go forward, sitting instead and looking at Willa with an expression she had come to trust more than her own judgment. She led the mule 20 yards upstream to a narrower point where the current ran faster and the ice had never fully formed, and there they crossed safely, the animals stepping carefully on the exposed rocks, and Willa understood that Odessa's advice about trusting the dog's instincts over her own eyes had already saved them once before the real danger had even begun. By late afternoon, the snow started, not heavy at first, just a fine, dry powder that stung the face and coated the pines. But the wind was rising with it, and Willa knew from a lifetime on this land that the fine snow was only the outer edge of something much larger gathering its strength behind the ridge. She pushed the mule harder than she wanted to, aware that the map showed at least another 3 hours of climbing before the split pine, and she talked to Copper in a low, steady voice as they went, not because he needed the words, but because she did. Because a voice in a white silence was a way of proving to herself that she had not already lost her mind to the cold. They found the split pine as the light was failing, a massive old tree cracked down the center by some ancient lightning strike, its two halves leaning away from each other like old arguing brothers, and Willa felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the sight of it. The first proof beyond her husband's dying whisper that this whole desperate journey was not simply the grief of a widow chasing shadows. She counted 12 paces from the base of the pine as the note had instructed, her boots sinking deep into fresh snow. And there, half hidden by a fall of rock and brush that had grown up over years of neglect. She found a narrow cleft in the cliff face that 100 travelers could have walked past without a second glance. The wind was screaming now in earnest, the light nearly gone, and she felt the first genuine fear she had allowed herself since leaving town. Not fear of the mountain, but fear of failing at the final step, of finding the door and not knowing how to open it while the storm closed its hand around them. She remembered Odessa's words, "Push low and to the left, never straight on." She knelt in the snow at the base of the rock face and found what looked at first like solid stone, until her gloved fingers found a seam, a place where the cold rock gave way almost imperceptibly to something that had been shaped by hands rather than by weather. She pushed low, angling her weight downward and to the left as instructed, and for a long, terrible moment nothing happened. The wind screaming past her ears, copper pressed against her side, shivering. And then, with a groan of old hinges and older stone, a section of the cliff face swung inward, revealing a black mouth of darkness that breathed out air noticeably warmer than the storm behind her. She led the mule and the dog inside, into a space that opened larger than she could have imagined from outside, a chamber carved and reinforced by trapper hands 2 generations gone, with a stone fire ring already built, a chimney shaft angled cleverly through the rock to draw smoke away from the entrance without revealing the shelter's location, and shelves cut into the walls holding jars and tins gone dusty with age but intact. Some kind of preserved stores left by whoever had built this place, along with a stack of dry wood that had somehow stayed dry through years of mountain winters. She pulled the door closed behind her, feeling the mechanism settle into place with a heaviness that spoke of deliberate craftsmanship. And for the first time in 16 days, Willa Prescott allowed herself to cry. Not from fear, but from something closer to relief. The specific relief of a woman who had trusted a dead man's final gift and found it true. She built a fire in the stone ring using the dry wood left behind, and the chamber filled slowly with warmth and orange light, and copper stretched out beside the flames with a contentment that told her they had truly, finally, arrived somewhere safe. The first days in the shelter established a rhythm that both comforted and tested her. She rationed the food carefully, supplementing her own stores with what remained edible among the old jars, mostly dried beans and a few tins of preserved meat that had somehow held against time and cold. She learned quickly that melting snow for water took far more fuel than she had accounted for, and she adjusted her fire building to conserve the dry wood, supplementing it with what she could gather from a small alcove deeper in the chamber, where more had been stored against exactly this need. On the 3rd day, moisture began to seep along one wall where the rock met an older seam, and she spent an anxious afternoon diverting it with a small channel dug into the dirt floor, remembering something her husband had written in his notes about the low side of the mountain carrying groundwater in the thaw, a detail he must have observed on his own scouting trip and recorded, not knowing exactly when she would need it. On the 5th day, the wind found a gap somewhere in the chimney shaft and began to whistle with an eerie, almost human quality that unsettled her until she traced the sound and packed the gap with a twist of cloth, silencing it. Each small crisis solved itself through patience and observation rather than force, exactly as Odessa had warned, and each time she succeeded, she felt her husband's presence in the solution, as though he had anticipated her exact fears from beyond the grave and left just enough guidance to let her solve them herself, rather than doing the solving for her. It was on the 7th day, while she was reorganizing the dusty shelves to make more efficient use of the space, that she found the letter. It had been folded into a tin behind a row of jars, wrapped in oilcloth like the map itself, and her hands trembled when she recognized her husband's handwriting on the outside. 3 words only: "If you're reading." She sat by the fire, with Copper's head heavy against her knee, and unfolded the pages, and Robert's voice came back to her across the 16 days since his death, in a way that undid every quiet resentment she had carried since the funeral, every unspoken question about why he had spent his last strength in the barn instead of beside her, why he had seemed distant in those final weeks when she needed him closest. The letter explained everything. He had known for months that his cough was not going to pass, had known before the doctor confirmed it, and rather than spend his remaining strength on despair, he had spent it on this, on scouting the old trapper's tale that Odessa had once mentioned to him in passing years before, on confirming the shelter still stood, on stalking it as best his failing body allowed, on drawing the map with hands that shook more each week, on writing the notes that would guide her when he could no longer speak the guidance aloud. "I could not give you a future," the letter said, "so I tried to give you a winter. I am sorry it could not be more. I am sorry I spent my last good days away from your side instead of in it, but I told myself that a man who loves his wife does not only sit with her while she grieves, he also builds the floor she'll stand on after he's gone. I hope you can forgive the distance. I hope you understand it was never absence. It was preparation." Willa wept over that letter until Copper pressed himself fully against her and would not be moved. And when she had no more tears left for that night, she folded the pages carefully back into their oilcloth and understood that grief and love had, in her husband's last months, become the same labor performed in silence. The storm outside, when it finally arrived in full force on the 9th day, was the kind that old-timers would speak of for a generation afterward, a blizzard that buried fence lines and stopped clocks and left 3 families in Miller's Bend without adequate wood before it broke. Willa heard its distant howl even through the mountain's rock, a sound like something enormous grinding its teeth. But inside the shelter, the fire held steady. The food stretched carefully across the days, and she and Copper weathered the worst of it in a warmth that felt almost indecent, given what she knew must be happening in the valley below. She thought often of Otto Bergman, wondering if his shallow cellar had held, of the Hollis family with their 6 children and their leaking roof, of Odessa alone at the edge of town with her traps and her herbs, and her refusal of help she likely would not have accepted even if offered. She did not think of them with satisfaction. She thought of them the way you think of people you have shared a hard winter with, regardless of what passed between you before the snow fell, because a mountain does not care who refused whom in October when it decides to unleash itself in January. On the 11th day, the wind dropped enough that she dared crack the door and look out at a world reshaped entirely in white, drifts higher than a man's head against the cliff face, the split pine barely visible under its new burden, and she understood that they would need to wait several more days before any attempt to return would be safe. She used the time to catalog exactly what remained of their supplies, exactly how many days of fuel and food stood between them and true hardship, and found with quiet satisfaction that Robert's foresight, combined with her own careful rationing, had left them with a comfortable margin. On the 14th day, with the storm fully broken and the sky showing a hard, clear blue that seemed almost mocking after what it had unleashed, Willa packed what remained of their supplies, resealed the shelter as best she could for whoever might need it next, and began the long, careful descent back toward Miller's Bend, with Copper leading the way through drifts that in places came up to the mule's chest. The journey down took longer than the journey up, every step measured and tested against the possibility of hidden ice or hollow snow. But they made it, arriving at the edge of town on the 16th day since the blizzard's first breath, to a scene of quiet devastation. Roofs collapsed under snow load, the Hollis family's barn reduced to splinters, and Otto Bergman standing outside his store with an expression that had lost all its former certainty, directing what few supplies remained toward families who had nothing left. He saw Willa coming down the trail with her mule and her dog, and her evident good health, and something crossed his face that was not quite shame and not quite wonder, a recognition that the widow he had turned away in October had somehow weathered what had broken half the town. She did not gloat. She had learned, in the letter and in the shelter and in the long white days between, that vindication tasted better shared than savored alone. She offered Bergman what she could spare of dried meat and beans from the old trapper's stores, not as payment for his refusal, but as the plain decency her husband's letter had reminded her that love required, even when it was not returned in kind. She told the Hollis family where the shelter stood, drawing them a rough copy of the map for future winters, explaining Odessa's warning about the low door and the patient mechanism, and Mrs. Hollis, who had given her a tin of candles she could not really spare, wept when she understood what that small gift had helped make possible. She visited Odessa last, finding the old woman's cabin standing, though barely, its roof sagging under the weight it had carried. And when Willa offered to help repair it, Odessa looked at her for a long moment before nodding once, accepting help she had never asked for and would never have requested, because some gifts only make sense once winter has proven their necessity to everyone involved. In the weeks that followed, as the thaw crept slowly back into the valley, and Miller's Bend began the long work of rebuilding what the storm had taken, Willa returned often to the hollow shelter in the cliff, not out of necessity, but out of something closer to reverence, bringing supplies to restock what she had used, teaching herself and eventually a few trusted neighbors the location and the mechanism of that low door that opened only to patience. She kept the map folded against her chest still, though she no longer needed it to find her way, because some objects carry more than directions. They carry the whole weight of a person's final act of love, and she was not ready to set that weight down. She kept the letter in the same tin where she had found it, reading it on the anniversary of his death each year that followed. And she kept the notes in his careful, failing hand, the ones about 12 paces and low doors and groundwater on the low side. because they were the last conversation she would ever have with her husband. Spoken not across a bedside, but across a mountain. Delivered not in his voice, but in his handwriting. And she understood, by the time the snow finally melted for good, that a legacy is not always land or money or a name carried forward. Sometimes it is simply the exact knowledge of how to survive the winter someone else could see coming, folded small enough to carry against your heart, and unfolded exactly when you need it most. Copper lived 8 more years after that winter, graying slowly at the muzzle, and every time a storm gathered on the horizon in the color Odessa had once warned her about, he would rise from his place by the fire and pace toward the door, and Willa would follow him without question. Because she had learned in the mountains that the ones who love you without words are often the ones who see the danger first, and the ones who love you with careful handwriting are the ones who make sure you survive it. If this story moved something in you, stay a while longer, because there are more winters like this one waiting to be told. More widows and wanderers and quiet acts of love disguised as maps and matches and folded oilcloth. And if you want to walk beside them, all you have to do is stay close, subscribe, and let the next story find you the way this one found her.